to make sure that they could get financing from other from banks.
No, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC, which is its acronym, is this is a group that's pretty unknown to most Americans. What does it do?
Well, in short, this is the smallest but perhaps most powerful investment bank in the world. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation was created during the Nixon administration to provide loan guarantees and political risk insurance to American corporations seeking to do business overseas. OPIC is backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. Treasury. So whatever loans that they extend, whatever political risk insurance they extend, is backed by taxpayers. Well, for instance, the best example of OPIC coming to help Enron was for Enron's Dabhol power project. It was a huge power plant that Enron built in India. It was the largest private investment ever made in India in the last 15 years. Biggest single project in the last 2 decades in India as well. Well, Enron would not have been able to make that investment, which ended up being over $2 billion. It had partners with General Electric and Bechtel, the big construction engineering firm, to build this power plant. But they would have never been able to do it without the backing of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which came up with loan guarantees and political risk insurance to back the commercial banks who then took the risk on the project. But the Enron made certain that it courted the Clinton administration to make sure that they got the kind of treatment at OPIC that they wanted. And one former OPIC staffer told me, and I have it in the book, he said, whatever Enron wanted at OPIC, it got.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Robert Bryce. He's an investigative reporter who's written a new book called Pipe Dreams, Greed, Ego, and the Death of Enron. Let's talk about Enron's connections to George Bush Sr. and to George W. Bush. What were Enron's first contacts with George H.W. Bush?
Well, Ken Lay was an early contributor to George H.W. Bush when he made his first run for president against Ronald Reagan in 1980. Then later under the Reagan administration, Lay had a lot of contact with Bush in the effort to deregulate the natural gas markets, which was done under the Reagan administration. Then in 87, when Bush was running again for the White House, Lay was one of his first contributors. He gave him $1,000. He chaired fundraisers in Houston. Then when when Bush got to the White House, Lay had a sleepover at the White House with George H.W. Bush. So then in 1990, Bush selected Lay to be a co-chairman of the host committee for the Economic Summit of Industrialized Nations in Houston. So that gave Lay a lot of access to Margaret Thatcher and to Gorbachev and other leaders who had come to Houston for that meeting. So that was really, over that decade, the Lay-Bush connection really developed, and then that led to, of course, greater cooperation and donations from Lay and Enron to George W. Bush.
And before we get to George W. Bush, in 1993, Enron hired former Secretary of State James Baker and former Secretary of Commerce Robert Mosbacher, and they were just out of the first Bush administration. What was their positions with Enron?
Ken Lay hired, at about that same time, he hired James A. Baker III, Robert Mosbacher, and about that same time he hired Wendy Graham. But Baker and Mosbacher were hired by Enron to go to Kuwait and lobby the Kuwaitis on a power plant that Enron wanted to build in Kuwait. Now, this is right after the end of the Gulf War, and Kuwait had suffered enormous damage when the Iraqis invaded, and Enron was one of a number of companies that were really pushing the Kuwaitis to open up their markets and allow them to come in and open the power plant. Enron didn't get that contract for that power plant, but I mean, if there's an example of Enron really clearly buying influence, that one's unsurpassed.
So the lobbying in Kuwait that Baker and Mosbacher did, would you say that's a very typical revolving door kind of position to have from government to private business? Or does this seem to you as being something out of the ordinary?
I think that example of James A. Baker III going to work for Enron less than 3 months after he comes out of the State Department, is one of the most egregious abuses of the revolving door that I can recall. Here is a man who was the former Secretary of State, who played a key role in the war in Kuwait, in planning strategy and dealing with the Kuwaitis and dealing with other Arab states. And now, just as George H.W. Bush goes out of office, he turns around and sells himself as a lobbyist to a company that wants to profit essentially off of the war. And I think that I can recall no other example where a Secretary of State has been that blatant in terms of turning around and selling access.
Let's get to George W. Bush. Did Enron back George W. Bush in his campaign for governor of Texas?
Yes, George W. Bush was a great beneficiary of Enron's money, and all Enron executives donated $146,500 to George W. Bush's campaign, the executives and the company, whereas that was about 7 times more than they contributed to Ann Richards, who was the Democratic opponent to George W. and the incumbent.
Are there things that Governor Bush did in Texas that directly benefited Enron?
Well, yes, he signed into law a bill deregulating the state's electricity markets. Now, that was something that had been working through the Texas legislature for some time, but Enron lobbyists made it clear to me, and I talk about it in the book, that as they were pushing for electricity deregulation, they knew that whatever happened, if they got stymied by the governor's staff and they weren't getting the kind of hearing that they wanted from the governor's staff, they knew they could always call back to Enron headquarters in Houston and ask Lay to call the governor, and they could immediately get through. That was a clear example of where Enron lobbyists and Enron personnel felt that they had extraordinary access to the governor that a lot of other corporations in the state clearly did not.
During the 1990s, Enron's political contributions kept rising. You say those contributions quadrupled between 1992 and 96, rising to over $1.1 million in 1996, with about 81% of that money going to Republicans. By the year 2000, the figure more than doubled again to $2.4 million, with 72% of that money going to Republicans. Were you in on any behind-the-scenes discussions at Enron about the value of giving an increasing amount of money to politicians?
No, not really. I think in some ways you could even say that this was simply that they were identified, or they were aligned ideologically, that the Republicans were pushing a laissez-faire attitude, and that was clearly what Enron wanted. That was their whole business strategy was, leave us alone, let us go into these markets, let us open these markets and do what we will, and don't impede us.
What kind of contribution did Enron make to George W. Bush's presidential campaign?
Well, the company was a huge funder of the campaign throughout, and was Bush's biggest benefactor. I would argue that one of the key issues, though, that the company and Lay were able to make was during the Florida recount. Lay was a big contributor to the Bush campaign during the recount effort, but moreover, Enron supplied its airplanes to the Bush campaign during the Florida recount. And remember, this was in November of 2000. It was unclear who was going to prevail, whether it was going to be Al Gore or George W. Bush, and Enron provided its planes, as did 3 other Houston energy firms, Reliant Energy, Anadarko Petroleum, and Halliburton. All gave their planes to George W. Bush's campaign, which came at an absolutely critical time in order to allow the campaign to move its people from Houston to Washington to Florida to really manage their ability to and manage their whole campaign strategy.
Did the Democrats have companies that favored them supplying planes to them?
None. Al Gore didn't have any of this. Not only did George W. Bush during the recount out-fundraise him by about 4-1, Gore didn't have enough contacts or good enough contacts in the business community to say, hey, I need an airplane to get my guys from Tennessee or from Washington to Florida. None of his campaign expense filings or contribution filings have shown any campaign plane donations similar to what Bush was able to get from the Houston energy firms.
You say that Kenneth Lay recommended a total of 21 people for positions in the administration of George W. Bush. He only got 3 of the spots that he asked for, but these were critically important jobs to Enron. What positions were they?
the positions that Enron and Ken Lay wanted filled that were particularly important to them were to the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And in fact, one of the key appointees that Lay was backing was Pat Wood, who Lay had also backed for the head of the Texas Public Utilities Commission right after Bush became governor in Texas. But Wood was believed in deregulation of energy markets. He was a strong proponent of Enron's position, generally speaking. And after Bush was elected, Lay wrote him and said, "We want Pat Wood as the head of the FERC." And indeed, that's what happened. Bush appointed Wood and made him head of the FERC. Another position that another person that was backed by Enron was Nora Brownell, who was also put on the FERC board. The third position was Glenn McCullough, who was appointed to the chairmanship of the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was just as important from Enron's point of view as the FERC appointments, because Enron had been involved in a long battle with the TVA over contracts that it had to supply electricity to the TVA, and it wanted a sympathetic ear there. And by getting McCullough in that spot, Enron gained a tactical advantage.
There were other people in the Bush administration who were connected to Enron. Do you want to list some of them?
Well, sure. Tom White, Secretary of the Army, is probably the one who has the deepest Enron ties, and also the ones that have been the cause of the most speculation and most investigation. He was in a key position at Enron Energy Services. He was the vice chairman there. Enron Energy Services was touted by Enron as the next big thing. This was going to be the company that was going to go in, retrofit buildings, save companies money on their energy bills, and make a ton of money in the process. White made tens of millions of dollars in stock at Enron, and he, has alleged that he wasn't involved in, did not have any knowledge of the accounting irregularities that were happening at Enron Energy Services, and really aggressive accounting that was happening at Enron Energy Services. And then he was appointed to this key position within the Pentagon, where he also recommended, once he got there, that the Pentagon begin looking at energy outsourcing of the type that Enron was offering.
Now, you're right that all of this gave Enron unprecedented access to the White House. Give us an example that you consider to be the most extreme example of the access that they had.
Well, I think that in terms of the Bush administration, that influence was shown in the National Energy Policy plan that the White House released last year. This was a document, and the whole process was headed by Vice President Dick Cheney, and Enron had numerous meetings with Cheney during the drafting of this document. Ken Lay investigations have shown that he's had something like a dozen phone calls either to Karl Rove or to Cheney himself. He had a personal meeting with Cheney, and there are aspects of that National Energy Plan that, as it came out, that were clearly written that favored Enron.
Now, Enron hired Wendy Graham about 5 weeks after her tenure on the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, after her position there ended. What was her work with Enron?
She served on Enron's board and made tens of thousands of dollars as a director every year. She also got stock options as an Enron director. What makes her position at Enron so important was that when she served at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, one of her last acts as chairman of that commission was to push through a proposal that exempted Enron's energy trading business from any federal oversight. That was critically important because when she got that job in early '93, Enron's gas trading business, known as the Gas Bank, was just starting to take off, and the company needed a free hand. It needed to be assured that federal regulators were not going to step in and prevent it from doing all the derivative swaps, all the futures contracts that it was just now beginning to get involved in. So Graham went from passing through that regulation at the CFTC to Enron's board in a span of about 5 weeks.
Now, Wendy Graham is also married to Senator Phil Graham, and his Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000 contained what's been described as the Enron exemption. What was the Enron exemption?
Well, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000 was critically important again to Enron, because by 2000 the company's commodities futures and all of its derivatives business was enormous. The Commodity Futures Modernization Act took the regulation that Wendy Graham had passed through at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in '93 and codified it and made it into law. And it went a step further. It said that whatever derivatives or whatever commodity futures are being traded on online exchanges like the one that Enron was operating were completely exempt from federal oversight and regulation, even if they were designed to be fraudulent.